My name is Maya Hayakawa, and I am the moderator for this final session. Our theme is building forward together, being purposefully propositional in the solutions that make Africa a rule maker, not a rule taker. So this session specifically looks at the solutions. What is the way forward? And that's what we want to leave you with this conference. I'd like now to introduce my speakers for this session. Our two main objectives are to define what building forward together really means for a Pan-African civil society. And also our objective is to be propositional to an alternative model and pathway towards Africa and the rule maker, being the rule maker and not the rule taker, and what that really means for our continent. A global pandemic requires, at least at the global level, for a more inclusive recovery package. We've seen the devastating economic impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on African economies. A number of them were already stressed out. It was projected that this would be the first time in 25 years that African nations would go into recession. And looking at the recovery stages, and looking at the policies that are coming out of African governments in stimulus packages or whatever social economic support that they have handed out, we have seen that they're not as comprehensive as in other parts of the world. In context of building forward together, what macroeconomic policy space look like from a Pan-African feminist point of view? What do you think really needs to be done when it comes to the recovery of African economies from that feminist point of view?
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Crystal. It's really interesting to hear someone call me Miss Crystal, but I'll take it. I'm based in Nairobi, and I work with a new-ish collective called the NAWI Collective that gives a Pan-African feminist nuance and analysis of macro-level economic policies. So we work regionally and globally, and really excited to be here. This space has really reinvigorated my pride and also the fight in me to have a space that's truly African, and I really appreciate AfriDad for that. The indebtedness of African countries has reemerged as a really critical concern due to the COVID crisis. It's become increasingly obvious that what we're witnessing is not temporary, but rather structural. It didn't start now though, and COVID just uncovered very many things that have been in existence, especially from an African perspective and in our relationship with the global economy. But feminists have long called for economic policies, including debt reforms that take into account relations of power globally, nationally, locally, and within even households. And it's important to remember that a feminist approach will always center power as a point of analysis. A feminist approach to debt requires a deepened recognition and understanding of how debt extracts value from domestic economies and from economies historically considered non-productive. Such an approach takes seriously how debt has been used as a tool to maintain the economic status quo globally. It calls for the reform in the global financial system, a reform that is radical, that is feminist, and that centers Pan-African narratives. A debt crisis is also emerging for households, and this is something that a lot of people don't talk about. The COVID pandemic has also exacerbated poverty on the continent as a result of declining wages, increasing unemployment, and a lack of social protection on the continent for a majority. Informal workers, for example, represent 86% and 92% of men and women's total employment respectively, and nearly 9 in 10 young workers on the African continent, and that's a lot. The ILO reports that these workers constitute 82% of sub-Saharan Africans without access to social protection. And so with lockdown, these workers have been barred from raising incomes for themselves as well as their dependents. The households to which they belong have had to turn to other sources of income that are managed mainly through unremunerated gendered labor. And emerging evidence shows that women's level of indebtedness is also increasing, especially among single-headed households who have seen their income decline sharply and have acquired debt in order to access food and cover very basic needs. And so it is imperative that we link the conversation of sovereign debt with household debt. and remember that all oppression is linked, and it is in these linkages that our freedom will begin to be found. Feminists have long been concerned with the disproportionate burden that women carry in the costs of servicing debt. In particular, the concern has been on the negative implications of sovereign debt on the provisions of public services. At the policy externalization and debt nexus, African states have underinvested in provisioning of public services. And at the onset of the COVID pandemic, it was reported that almost 70% of households had basic sanitation. Half have electricity, but only 41% have had access to safe drinking water. In addition, a much smaller proportion have access to all three basic public services simultaneously. These public services have always been critical to social reproduction, and the lack of provisioning was brought to the fore by this pandemic. Some feminists argue that the increased privatization of social reproductive activities has externalized care to the family or household and debilitated healthcare systems. The social reproductive work undertaken largely by women has been assumed to be free and unlimited. And so what does this mean in a practical way? And we have three very top-line suggestions, and these can be found in the paper that NAWI presented. First is a reform of the global financial system by calling for debt restricting and relief that is not premised on conditionalities and prioritizes favorable terms to protect state sovereignty and increase fiscal space in a way that is progressive, especially for women. Two, implement domestic resource mobilization strategies premised on progressive and feminist transformative policies to finance the COVID responses and to anchor expectations for a riskier future because we know it will exist. And three, implement measures to reduce the indebtedness of households and better regulate loans made to households to prevent further crisis in social reproduction. And lastly, we cannot talk of building back better. What was built was never for us, only from us. What we must do, though, is build back together, build back differently, more radically, and on our own terms. This is the moment to completely reimagine what the world could be. We would like to reimagine through a feminist lens to build an Africa that is just, that is equitable, and that is inclusive. It's time for Africa to be a rule maker and find our liberation.
Crystal, thank you for that. Just a follow-up question on that. In the last 3 days, we've heard from various speakers on how the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on women on a different scale, on a different level, and also just in general, the inequalities that existed pre-COVID-19 that has exacerbated the impact the pandemic has had on women, and also in general, how the debt crisis has affected women. What are the 2 or 3 Pan-African feminist macroeconomic issues you feel in this conference we can take away to purpose in integrating national, continental, and global advocacy?
Sure, and I made reference to some of them, but definitely unpaid labor and the care economy. So much of the work that women do in carrying water, carrying firewood, but the emotional labor as well. And we've seen countries like Kenya announce strategies of care, home care as a strategy for COVID, but no conversation about what the detailing of that means. Who takes care of people, who's training them, who's remunerating, and how do we recognize this as labor? It is women's work that has been the backbone of communities, of societies, of economies, but it is this work that has completely been invisibilized for so long. So making sure that we are taking into recognition this work that is very important. Somebody needed to hug me to be here to be able to speak today, and it is this softer work as well that needs to be recognized. So the care economy and unpaid labor. Secondly, the financialization of life and existence. The World Bank is known for pushing their cascade approach, which is really using African states as de-risking mechanisms for private investment for developmental projects, healthcare, education, water, sanitation, transport. This comes at a cost, and we remain indebted for generations to come. And it also puts a barrier of access with, when we introduce user fees. And what does that mean for women being able to access maternal care? What does it mean if maternal care isn't as profitable and so it's off the table of investment? And I think these questions are imperative as we try and navigate the continent out of the COVID pandemic with a global pressure on us to use private finance tools to develop and to recover as well. So those are the two, but also thirdly and very importantly, I think our ideology and being able to unshackle our imagination really away from a neoliberal, neo-colonial construct that we have continued to exist in, and how can we really free ourselves for that to reimagine an Africa where we really are an African, where we're making the rules. And I think an ideological battle sits at the forefront of this war.
When we look at the feminist movement, I've heard of many different narratives when it comes to gender equality, terminologies like feminist principles and the feminist movements. For those that really do not understand the difference between the three terminologies, could you explain that a little bit further?
Sure. So I identify as a Pan-African feminist, and I will put in the chat box the African Feminist Charter, which guides a lot of our ideological thinking. We also must remember that to identify as Pan-African as well is an added layer of but complexity. Feminists across the world are fighting for the same thing, but we need to remember that our history, our nuance, our context means that our sort of feminism is different. I also identify as an intersectional feminist, which means I recognize that people have different and sometimes conflicting, things that they carry in their lives, and what that means in terms of how they exist and what they can access in the world, right? So making sure that we carry, yes, a Pan-African identity, making sure that we remember our nuance, our history, our slavery, slave trade histories, our colonial histories, and currently what is a Wall Street consensus, as some academics have put it, making sure that there's an intersection with that very political, power construct, with a feminism that is looking for equality for men and women. We're not looking to take over the world. It's really the basic fight to say that men and women should have equal access to opportunity, really. I hope that answers your question. Feminism also puts power as a central part of analysis when you look at anything from economics to trade to whatever it is. Power has to be a central point of analysis.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Data and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.